Welcome to day 14. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that I could probably spend 3 or 4 days on just talking about this topic alone. So I'm going to try and fly through it as quickly as I can in the most clear way that I can. So we're going to be talking about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are made up of simple sugars or saccharides. And most carbohydrates are broken down into simple sugars and then converted to glucose. And this glucose is then used by our cells as a source of energy. And I say most carbohydrates because some carbohydrates actually cannot be broken down by the body. So they are not broken down into glucose, but they still have a very important role in the body. And we'll talk about what those are. So on the right here, I have a little figure that shows a monosaccharide, so that's just one saccharide, and that would be something like glucose, and a disaccharide, which is just two monosaccharides bound together, and then a polysaccharide is multiple saccharides in one chain. So we'll talk about each of those individually. So monosaccharides, there are 3 of them: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Glucose is the basic simple sugar that's used by the body in a lot of different metabolic processes in the body. Fructose is a simple sugar that's found in food, and it's converted into glucose in the body. And galactose is a component of milk sugar, which is also converted into glucose in the body. Disaccharides are made up of some combination of fructose, galactose, and glucose. So lactose, which is found in cow's milk, is actually a disaccharide, which is composed of a glucose molecule and a galactose molecule bound together. And once they are ingested, the body digests them into their separate parts. So it breaks them apart into glucose and galactose, and then it further converts galactose into glucose. Maltose is not a sugar that we find very often, but it is in some alcoholic beverages and molasses, and that's essentially 2 glucose molecules bound together. So when we consume maltose, it doesn't have to be converted at all, it's just broken apart into glucose. And then sucrose is fructose bounded to a glucose molecule, and this particular type of disaccharide is found in fruits, vegetables, table sugar, cane sugar, beet sugar, and almost every single processed food there is. Polysaccharides are also called complex carbohydrates, and these include things like glycogen, which is a long chain of saccharides that's stored in the liver and the muscles, and it can be used later as a source of energy, especially in some kind of high intensity exercise that your body needs a really quick source of energy. So it's really good. It taps into the glycogen stores for that particular type of exercise. Starch is a polysaccharide, which can be broken down by the body into different saccharides, those 3 basic ones: fructose, galactose, and glucose. Fiber, there's 2 different kinds. One is soluble, meaning that it's soluble in water, and the other is insoluble, meaning that it's not soluble in water. And one particular example of an insoluble fiber is cellulose. So now I want to talk about the glycemic index. The glycemic index is basically the time that it takes for any carbohydrate that you've consumed to become glucose and to be released into the bloodstream. And when glucose is in the bloodstream, that's called blood sugar. So a fast time would be a high glycemic index. So if you consume something that has a high GI or glycemic index, that means that it's being converted into glucose very, very fast. If you have a low glycemic index, that means that whatever you consumed is being converted into glucose very, very slow. So if you look at the chart below, something like pure glucose has a very high glycemic index because the body doesn't need to do any work to break it down. It's basically already in the form that it needs, so it gets shot right into the bloodstream almost immediately after consumption. But something like beans have a low GI, which means that the time that it takes for the sugars in beans to become glucose is a lot longer than straight glucose. So it has a low glycemic index. Glycemic load is something similar but not the same. And this measure basically tells how fast a food will spike blood sugar, and it also factors in the amount of carbohydrates per serving that you're consuming. So glycemic index basically just talks about one food, and it doesn't talk about how much of that food we are consuming in one sitting. So the glycemic load factors in both the glycemic index and the grams of carbohydrate that's being consumed at one time. And then the glycemic load is calculated by multiplying the GI by the grams of carbohydrates and dividing by 100. So if we compare the glycemic index and the glycemic load, if foods have a high glycemic index and a high glycemic load, these things are like bread, cereals, pastries, pasta, candy, fruit juice. Those things are not very good in the body. They do a lot of things. They mess up hormones. They cause blood sugar spikes, and after a blood sugar spike is a blood sugar crash. So they do a lot of things in the body that aren't favorable for metabolic function, for optimum function, I should say. It's not possible to have a low glycemic index and a high glycemic load just because of the way that the glycemic load is calculated, because it's based on the glycemic index. So if we have a low glycemic index, we typically have a low glycemic load as well. So having a high glycemic index and a low glycemic load per serving would be something like a fruit, which if you look at the glycemic index for like an apple, let's say, it has a pretty high glycemic index, which means that it's converted into glucose rather quickly, but it has a low glycemic load because of all the fiber in it. And then foods with a foods with a low glycemic index and a low glycemic load are things like nuts, seeds, vegetables, meat, things that don't really have a lot of sugar in them and don't really cause that spike in insulin, or blood sugar, I should say. So speaking of insulin, let's talk a little bit about that. So insulin is a hormone that's released from the pancreas, and it's released in response to blood sugar. So once that glucose gets into the blood, the pancreas spits out insulin. And insulin's main job is to transport glucose to cells in order to be used as energy. And if there's any leftover glucose that the cells don't need anymore, then that is stored as fat. It's actually stored as glycogen first, and then stored as fat as soon as your glycogen stores are full. Foods with a high GI or a high glycemic load can cause a spike in blood sugar, and that causes a surge of insulin to be released from the pancreas. And repeated surges of insulin can cause the pancreas to become burned out, which ultimately leads to insulin resistance. So insulin resistance means that no more insulin is being produced by the pancreas, and that also means that glucose cannot be used by cells. So insulin resistance is basically the first indication that someone has prediabetes or diabetes. All right, let's talk about good versus bad carbs. Bad carbs are things like high fructose corn syrup, sucrose or table sugar, artificial sweeteners, which actually aren't real carbohydrates, but they are man-made carbohydrate molecules. So these include sucralose, aspartame, and saccharin. So anything in a yellow packet, a blue packet, or a pink packet, those are typically artificial sweeteners, and they're in a lot of different foods too. And anything that's sugar-free typically has artificial sweeteners in it. So try and stay away from anything that's sugar-free. Good carbohydrates are fiber-rich foods like whole fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and beans. And I say whole fruits and vegetables because fruit juice tends to be very high in simple sugars and therefore high on the glycemic index and causes a spike in insulin. So you want to go for the whole fruit rather than the fruit juice. And you want to be careful when you're using fruits in smoothies as well, because even though they're whole fruits, you're probably adding more fruit to a smoothie than you would eat probably in one serving. So you want to be careful of that because the sugar can add up pretty quickly. And then starches are also good carbs as long as you're eating them in moderation, because they do break down into glucose. And as I mentioned before, if there's any excess glucose in the blood, that turns into fat. If your goal is to gain weight, then go ahead and eat starches as much as you would like. Or if you have a very high activity level, so if you're just naturally active, or you are an elite athlete or something like that, then starches would be a good energy source for you because you're going to burn through it really quickly. So that's all I have for carbohydrates, and like I said, I could spend days on this topic alone, but I really just wanted to give you just a general overview of what carbohydrates are. So what I want you to do for your homework is to take a look at the types of food that you eat and start to kind of see where they fall on the glycemic index and the glycemic load charts. You can do this just by Googling whatever food it is and then typing glycemic index afterwards. Or you can Google glycemic index or glycemic load charts, and you can see where different foods fall on that. So that's all we have for today. Thanks.